Okay, so we have a lot of guests today, and if you're a guest, let me explain what's going on, because this is a different type of topic that we're talking about in Bible class. It's a little unusual, but I asked earlier in the year for Discover to give me some topics they wanted to talk about, and I have about 6 months worth of material, and we're kind of in month 2 of those 6 months. The month of June, we talked about dating and marriage. In July, what we're doing is we're talking about questions people have about churches of Christ. Many of you here today did not grow up in churches of Christ. Some of you maybe did grow up in churches of Christ that are different than Press and Crest. And so I'm just dealing with some of these questions that have been submitted. And one we're going to deal with today is, what about instrumental music? We do not use instruments in our worship services on Sunday morning at Press and Crest. And maybe you grew up in a Church of Christ that did not use instruments. If you grew up Church of Christ, more than likely that's the case. If you did not grow up within Churches of Christ and you're coming to Press and Crest, you may be wondering, why aren't there instruments on the stage? Why is there not a band? And so we're going to deal with that a little bit today. Now, for a disclaimer here about this topic, and I have some other disclaimers that we'll deal with this topic in just a moment. But what I'm wanting to do today, I'm presenting to you historically the arguments, for a lack of a better term. I like the term position better than argument, because argument sounds very controversial. The positions churches of Christ have held over the years as to why we have not used instruments. So I want you to interpret everything I'm saying through that lens. This is the historical perspective for some reason as to why, for the most part, instruments have not been used in churches of Christ. Let me get into these disclosures before we begin with the topic of this nature. Number one, this topic has been debated for centuries, and that is not an exaggeration. For centuries, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So to think that we can exhaustively cover this in one class is not realistic, because this has been being discussed for a very long time. Number two, this is a hot topic issue, maybe not as much today as it's been in the past, but it is a very much of a debatable issue that has led to the separation of different church groups, most notably for our context. In 1906, there was the separation of the Disciples of Christ and Churches of Christ, and it was over this issue, instrumental music. And in 1906, within Texas, that's when ACU begins, and Disciples of Christ follow TCU. If you did not know, they used to be the same school up until 1906, which is also why both of them are purple, if you've ever wondered about that. They were the same school. So this has been big enough to separate religious groups. So if we just say, this is really not that big of a deal, for some people, throughout the centuries, this has been a really big topic and discussion. And so because of that, I think it's important for us to view this topic with respect. It transcends far beyond words like tradition or preference. You may be here this morning, especially if you did not grow up in Churches of Christ, and you may be saying, this seems really silly to fight about. And if you're that way, I respect that point of view. I really do. But I want you to hear that for a lot of people within Churches of Christ, this has not been a silly issue. It's been a serious issue that has led to division and separation. Now, we can debate all day long if it should have been that serious. I'm not here for that debate. What I am saying is it has been. And so we have to deal with this respectfully and realize that we're dealing with a lot of emotions and a lot of history when we deal with a subject of this nature. So with those disclosures moving forward, what I'm going to do today, and we've done this with different topics, with dating and marriage. If you remember, sometimes I will kind of list different points or positions based on importance. I'm not listening today based on importance. What I am doing is I'm going to give you 4 positions that Churches of Christ have offered throughout their history as to why instrumental music should not be used in worship. And in my opinion, this is strictly Jacob's opinion, but in my opinion, I'm listing them from least credible to most credible. Least credible to most credible. My opinion doesn't have to be yours, so I just want you to know where my mind is on which positions hold the greatest weight. Okay? And so we'll start with the first one. I think it's I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get there in just a second. Let me deal with just a few other indisputable facts. We talked about disclosures. Here are some indisputable facts. Take it as you will. Instrumental music is mentioned in the Old Testament, but it disappears as a practice of the church in the New Testament. It's frankly not there. Tithing's not there. Animal sacrifice is not there. Keeping the Sabbath day, not there. In the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. For people who say, yeah, but they used instruments in the Old Testament, they absolutely did. No one's saying they didn't. You don't see a single instance of it in the New Testament. Is there a reason for that? There very well could be. We'll talk about more in just a moment. We know from stories like Leviticus 10 that there were those in the Bible who were punished for worshiping God in unauthorized ways. Whatever that term means, it's an indisputable fact that in Leviticus chapter 10, these two brothers, Nadab and Abihu, they lose their lives because they decide to worship God on their own terms. What those terms were, I don't know. No one does. Some type of censer and fire and something that we don't know a whole lot about. Indisputable, though, the reason they lost their life, according to Leviticus 10, was for worshiping God in an unauthorized way. It's also indisputable that Jesus says we must worship Him in spirit and in truth. I'm not debating what those two words mean there, spirit and truth. I'm just saying everyone can accept that these words come from the mouth of Jesus. These are the type of worshipers that the Father seeks, according to Jesus. Those who worship in spirit and those who worship in truth. Okay, so let's get to these positions here that churches of Christ have historically held that oppose instrumental music. As always, I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, but if you see something right now that you want to know more about, please stop me so we don't skip over it, because I want you to ask anything you want to ask. One argument that you'll often hear or position is what we call silence of the Scriptures. Now again, in my opinion, of the four I'm going to give you today, this is the least credible. This is the most problematic to defend over and over again. But silence of the Scriptures is exactly how it sounds. If the Bible does not endorse or describe a teaching or practice, either through a command or through an example of people in the Bible doing it, then we can infer that the silence is intended. The silence is there for a reason. It's on purpose. And so we need to acknowledge that the silence is there and not go beyond that silence. Pretty self-explanatory. It's not enough to say that the Bible says we can't, which is what a lot of people will argue for those who want to use instrumental music. The Bible doesn't say that you can't use an instrument. Correct. But that's not the issue according to the position of silence of the Scriptures. The burden of proof rests on the Bible saying that you can. You need a command or you need an example. And again, when you don't have that command saying that you should or that you can, that silence there, according to this position, should be interpreted for a reason. And here's just an everyday example. You may have heard this before, but if a wife tells her husband, go to the store and get some milk, she doesn't have to tell them, and when you're there, don't get tortillas. That's just kind of implied by go get me some milk. And if you think about it, it's just a basic example from everyday life, but the logic of that is consistent here. If I tell you that I want you to go do something, I don't have to tell you everything I don't want you to do for you to go do what I do want you to do. And so that's the logic behind silence of the Scriptures. What we know for sure is that God told us He wants us to sing and to make music in our hearts to the Lord. He doesn't have to tell us everything He doesn't want us to do. He tells us what He does want us to do. Now, the issue with the position of silence of the Scriptures is that we're not always consistent with silence of the Scriptures. And that's why, in my opinion, of the four positions, it's the least credible. I think it makes a lot of sense, but there are some things we do in the church the Bible never addresses, and it seems like maybe we've gone a little bit beyond the silence there for these issues, and we haven't with this one. So people will say, well, here's another position to consider. And this is from the Greek word psallo. I gave the pronunciation there for all you non-Greek folks. Psallo. And this is not just a New Testament word. This is a word that also appears in the Old Testament, what we call the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And this word psallo in the New Testament appears 10 different times, but probably the verse that's most famous for talking about a cappella singing is Ephesians 5:19. Speak to one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Sing and make music. That's that word psallo. Make music in your heart to the Lord. Now we're going to get a little bit technical here. Stay with me on this. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. Psallo literally means to pluck the strings of. That's what the word means. To pluck the strings of. And what's interesting about this word psallo is that an object must always be connected to that word, psallo. So you have to pluck the strings of something. It's kind of like the word kick. When you're kicking, you're going to be kicking something. You're going to kick a ball. You're going to kick a person. Hope you don't do that. You're going to kick your dog, but you're going to kick something, right? There has to be an object connected to psallo. You have to pluck the strings of something. Now, what's interesting is that all throughout the Old Testament, there is a type of musical instrument that appears with that word psallo, to pluck the strings of. And you can see this in Psalm 144, verse 9, but it can be a harp, it can be a lyre, or a lyre, but it's connected to that word psallo. When we get over to the New Testament, whenever you find the word psallo, the only object that ever appears is either the heart or the mind. I listed the heart there twice, my bad. Or the soul. The heart, the mind, or the soul. There's no musical instrument listed in the New Testament. I have a copy of this book in my office if you ever want to read it. He's a former professor of mine. For those who went to Harding, you may remember the name Dr. Tom Alexander. He used to be the dean of the College of Bible at Harding. He's retired now. But he wrote this book called Music and Worship, A New Examination of an Old Issue. It's only about 130 pages long. In my estimation, it's the best book written in practical terms with a lot of scholarly research. If you want to read it, I'll be more than happy for you to have it. And then give it back to me. But page 71, Dr. Alexander explains in academic language when I'm talking with you about practicality. He says, the Greek Old Testament names an instrument to be plucked, or an instrument that accompanies the singing when psallo is accompanied by a prepositional phrase, identifying the instrument, such as Psalm 144, verse 9, instrument there being the harp or the lyre. But in Ephesians 5:19, Paul uses a simple construction to identify the instrument that is to be plucked or played when Christians sing. They sing and they make melody in or on or with the heart. So he's saying what I've been saying to you. This word psallo is not just a New Testament word, it's an Old Testament word too. And in the Old Testament, it's always connected to a musical instrument. In the New Testament, it's only connected to the heart, or to the mind, or to the soul. I think this is fascinating. If you've heard of concordances before, Strong's Concordance is one of the most well-known. And this is how they define the word psallo. People who did Strong's Concordance are not Church of Christ people. Okay? They're not. But look how they define the word. To strike the strings or chords of an instrument, to play on a stringed instrument, to sing to music, but in the New Testament, to what? To sing praises. Even Strong's Concordance says that in the New Testament, this word means to sing praises. In the Old Testament, it didn't mean that. but it means that this way in the New Testament. I think that is fascinating. But people who are not from churches of Christ come to the same conclusion. Okay, that's the first two positions. First one is silence of the Scriptures. And like I said, makes sense, has some holes in it because we're not always consistent. The next one is solo. A little bit stronger evidence than silence of the Scriptures. Here's my problem with only relying on solo. What if someone doesn't know Greek? And what if someone doesn't understand everything that I just presented to you? Are they to be convinced? Well, let's go to the third position that I think is even stronger than silence of the Scriptures and even stronger than solo. This is what we like to call church history. Okay? You can learn about something by looking at the past. The first appearance of an instrument in Christian worship does not appear until 657 AD. And that's attributed to Pope Vitalian, who was in Rome. 657 AD. Jesus dies anywhere from 30 to 33 AD, depending on which calendar you're using. So 620 years of the church worshiping. 620 years. Almost 3 times the amount of time that America has been in existence. For all that time, there's not an instrument. I think that means something. Especially if you consider that the people who really make up the first church on the day of Pentecost are Jewish people who have come out of Judaism where they did use instruments, or they were used to using them. And then for 620 years you don't see one? That's got to mean something, right? I don't think that's a coincidence. Everett Ferguson, who was a member of Churches of Christ, one of the best scholars within Churches of Christ, wrote this in his book, The Church of Christ, A Biblical Ecclesiology for Today. He takes it further than 657 AD. He says, simply singing was the historical practice of the church for approximately 1,000 years of her existence. So, nutshell, several generations pass after the beginning of the church before an instrument ever appears. Anyone know the name John Wesley? Who's John Wesley? Okay, he starts the Methodist Church. Now, he lives from 1703 to 1791. Someone asked John Wesley his opinion of instrumental music. Should instruments be used in worship? And John Wesley, the man who started the Methodist Church, made this comment: I have no objection to instruments of worship, provided they are neither seen nor heard. You sense his sarcasm. This is not just a Church of Christ issue. We call it a church. The Methodist Church didn't use them. The Baptist Church, when it begins, they don't use them. The Lutheran Church, they don't use them. It wasn't common practice. And here's the man that begins a denomination saying he's opposed to it. I have no objection is tongue-in-cheek. He's absolutely opposed to it, provided that they are neither seen nor heard. That's church history. And I think that means something. In fact, I think that's more convincing than solo, because you may not know the Greek language. And I think that's more convincing than silence of the Scriptures, because it's hard to be completely consistent with that. But then the last position. Okay, silence of the Scriptures, solo, church history. The word a cappella. What does that word a cappella mean? Yes. Say it a little bit louder, Robert.
In the style of the chapel.
In the style of the chapel, or in the manner of the church. That's what that word means. People all the time say a cappella means without musical instruments. No, it doesn't. A cappella means in the style of the chapel or in the manner of the church. Why is that notable? Because when the church begins, this is the term that the world uses to describe what the church did. This is how they worshiped. This was the manner. this was the style, which confirms the church history that they weren't using it. It's kind of like the word Christian, you know. That term Christian initially was a term of disrespect, but it was used for someone who followed Jesus. So those words mean something. The word a cappella means something. Why would the world use the word a cappella to describe what the church did unless that's exactly what the church was doing? It's kind of like, fast forward in history, hundreds of years, but we weren't alive during the American Revolution, but we know from history that the British had red uniforms in battle. Why do we know that? They were called the Redcoats. And I didn't have to be alive to know that, but that was the term used to describe who they were and what they looked like. This is the term that was used to describe what the church did and what their worship looked like. This is back to Thomas Alexander from that book, Music and Worship, A New Examination of an Old Issue. This is a great point. If something was present in the New Testament church, there should be some trace of it later in the practice of the church. What he's saying is, if something was taking place right after the church begins, you should be able to read about it 300-400 years later, like baptism, like elders, like teaching generations of faith. But you can't. It's not in there because it wasn't happening. Now, we can interpret that the way that we want to, but I hope you see from all four of these positions, from silence to solo to church history to a cappella, this is more than just a preference or a tradition. There's a lot of justification for why churches of Christ have believed what they have believed about this issue. But I want to end here, and then I'm going to open it up for you to ask whatever questions you want to ask. The discussion of instrumental music and worship or any other Christian practice or doctrine, one which we'll talk about next week, why does God call men to be leaders in the church? It's guided by one principle, and it's biblical authority. It's not just a choice to be a cappella or to not have instruments. It's, what does the Bible say about this issue? And historically, churches of Christ have wanted to make every decision about leadership and practice and doctrine and way of life based on that concept. What does the Bible say? We want to do what the Bible says. We want to do nothing less. We want to do nothing more. We just want to speak where the Bible speaks. We want to be silent where the Bible is silent. That has been churches of Christ's way of interpreting the Bible for hundreds of years. Do we always do that perfectly? No. Not even close. But that's the goal. And that's the vision or the focus of the practice.